It is in going back to a few things over and over that you will get more personal benefit, more personal education, just general fulfillment in revisiting those things rather than constantly new. Hello and welcome to the Musician Toolkit, episode number 77. My name is David Lane, and it is great to be with you once again. Well, it's not quite summer yet, but we are in the month of June, and, we're past Memorial Day and all that. So if you're like me, summer really isn't that much different than spring, fall, and winter as far as like workload and so forth. But if this is downtime for you, I hope you have a good time off. I would say, and this is probably, a future episode. I have said this before as part of a list episode where I listed off some things. If you're aspiring to make it big as a musician and to really succeed, let me go ahead and say right now, don't take the summer off. That is to say, sure, take a few days off here and there, take maybe a week off or whatever, but even if you're on vacation, devote some time to doing one of the following things: reading about music, or reading about business, or reading about pedagogy, reading and studying some music theory. If you're a composer, you should be composing. Take your instrument with you, or if you're a pianist, take even a smaller keyboard. I speak from personal experience when I say that it is potentially a big stunt to your growth if you don't take advantage of the leisure time that summer brings if you're a student. So I just wanted to say that. This is also where I would say it's a good idea to go to summer camps. We're probably past time for all of the ones that you could go to for registration. So either you're doing that this year or you're not. Definitely keep it in mind for future years. But even without a camp, you can still use this time for personal growth. To that end, at this point in the podcast history, I do not run ads on the episodes. So this is as close to a commercial as I'm going to get at this point. If you are a high school or a college student and you want to just brush up on music theory and you would just like some tutoring, someone to help you review that, or if you are a composition student who wants a few extra lessons this summer, send me a message at my website at davidlanemusic.com. There's a contact form just at the bottom of the home page. And if you're interested, let's set up a time. I offer a free consultation to every prospective student to make sure that both of us think that it's a good fit. And if I can help you grow this summer, I would love that opportunity. The title of today's episode is More Review, Less New for Success. For most of our marriage, my wife and I have had different tendencies when it comes to consuming other media, whether we're talking about reading books, listening to audiobooks, watching movies or television, or listening to music. And kind of with maybe a few exceptions in movies, we've been very similar in some ways. But for the most part, I am all about watching something new, reading a new book. Prior to a few years ago, I really only reread books if I didn't like them, but I kept hearing about how good they were, and I was like, well, maybe I missed something, so I would give them another chance. Again, with few exceptions. Whereas my wife has found some things that she enjoys, and if it's an audiobook that she really likes the narrator, not just the story, and she will listen to that series over and over and over. And there are certain albums or certain bands that she will listen to over and over. She's the type, she can recite all the lyrics because she's heard them so much. We both have certain movies that we have watched over and over to the point to where we can quote from those movies out of context. And it's actually kind of fun because it's a thing that we do. It's movies that we've watched, TV shows that we've watched enough that it's a fun thing that we can just interject in conversations. So where am I going with this? Well, one of the podcasts that I follow that I especially recommend, just checking out is if you want more specifics to the business side of things. It's called The Six Figure Creative, and it's hosted by Brian Hood. And Brian has very often on the episodes that have come out this year, he has said this more than one time. He has said, we need to be reminded more often than we need to be taught. Now, he says that in context of we've done this topic before on an episode, but we need to be reminded more often than we need to be taught. And I find that's true because I've been thinking about how many books about business, books about psychology, self-help books, some things that I've read that I have said that I really enjoyed, and I went on Goodreads and I gave a 5-star review, and it seems kind of detailed, and yet never thought about the book again. It never really impacted my life because it was one and done. If you read a book and it moves you in any way, you owe it to yourself to take notes on the book, to highlight portions or underline portions that said something to you. You should write down the thoughts that you had from the book, but also you should plan to read it again. And if it's really good, you should put it on a rotation of books that you read, if not every year, every few years. By the way, this is not something that I'm doing particularly well at the moment. It's something that I'm doing better, much better than I used to. So the things that I'm talking about, I'm not representing like the ultimate example of how to do it. I'm sharing what I'm trying to do better, and what I have found is improving my overall experience with a lot of things. But we're not going to just keep it on books, but I just want to use that as an example. As I mentioned already, there's already an advantage to going back and rewatching movies and television that I enjoyed. So first of all, just in terms of the idea of sunk cost when it comes to time. How often have you spent 2 hours watching something, wishing you could get those 2 hours back? Whereas if you watch something that you already enjoy, and maybe you haven't seen it in a while, and you just want to revisit it, well, you know that that's 2 hours you're going to be glad that you spent. Music. We've talked about the incredible value, not just for enjoyment, but for educational purposes. The importance of re-listening to music. As I mentioned before on a Twitter poll, that's like the most benefit I've ever gotten out of using Twitter before, and this was, before all of the algorithms changed and it became X and so forth. But I asked the classical Twitter community and got quite a bit of response. I think I got nearly like 300 responses, but it was 200 something. Of how often do you need to listen to a classical piece before you feel like you can, with confidence, say that you know the music? And the choices I gave was just once, twice, 3 times, or the fourth choice was 4 or more. Well, it was a landslide victory for the 4 or more. You listen to a piece once, twice, or 3 times, you just don't have enough experience with the music to understand what's going on. And I wouldn't just say that's not just classical, that's any music that has had some thought put into the production or the composition of it. And that covers a variety of genres. There are good albums, good musicians, good artists, and bands in every genre. So if you like a piece, if you like something you hear after the first time, we have a word for that. We have a phrase for that. It's called a good first impression. And likewise, if you didn't enjoy something, we call that a bad first impression. But you know what? I bet there are people in your life that you really liked when you met them, but as you found out more about them, you don't like them as much anymore. And I also bet there are people that when you first met them, you didn't enjoy them as much. You didn't really click with them, but as you got to know them, they became friends. I know that I have examples of both of those types of people, and there are albums like that too. So now you have to decide what's worth revisiting and what's not. If you don't think there's any value after one listen, if your thing is, okay, I feel like I get this, I just don't care for it, well, you don't need to come back to it. But if you think there's some stuff there, but I just really it didn't click with me, I didn't really enjoy it, but you think there's something there that you might be able to get out of repeated listenings, well, that is the type of music you should go back to multiple times. And go back to it until you feel like if it has lyrics, you can quote the lyrics. For me, that's a good test, because I am one of those people, I don't hear the lyrics until I feel like I've kind of exhausted what I'm listening for musically. It's like I'm always amazed at people who can just like sing along with all of the songs, and I find out that it tends to be, people who aren't as trained in musicianship, because they're not listening to every aspect of the music. They're listening to the overall effect, and then they're focusing on the lyrics. For instrumental music, it's when I can start singing the melody without hearing it, when I can go to the piano even and play an excerpt from what I've heard. That is when I know that I'm really starting to listen and really starting to get familiar with the music. So again, it's easy to have a goal of, I want to listen to as many albums as possible, or I want to listen to as much music as I possibly can. But it is in going back to a few things over and over that you will get more personal benefit, more personal education, just general fulfillment in revisiting those things rather than constantly new. Now, I have a tendency to be an obsessive person. I'm recording this while my wife is not in the house. You would hear her laughter from any point if she had heard me say that right there, because she knows that this is true. I went from not being much of a reader to being an obsessive reader. I had a streak of audiobooks and books combined of 200 or more per year. That went for quite a while. It got interrupted one year, and then it picked back up again. And then I had one year that I got to 295, and I'm like, well, that's silly. I'll never do that again. And then the next year I got to 330 or something like that. Now, I want to point out a few things about that achievement of reading or listening to audiobooks, and that number being 330 or more in a year, basically almost one a day. It's really silly. So I'll ignore the fact that I did not accomplish very much that year in terms that I could have, because I spent so much time doing this other thing that didn't matter as much. But let's get back to that. How many people do you think were impressed that I read that much? That like I posted about it on social media. How many responses do you think I got? Maybe 5 or 6. But let's get back to an important question. How many books from that year did I read that I still think about, that I want to go back and revisit, that really mattered? Maybe 2, maybe 3. So I just looked this up. As of August 2023, it was estimated that since the invention of Gutenberg's printing press in 1440, there have been published 129,864,880 books. If you were such a fast reader that you could read one book an hour, and you opted not to sleep, which, of course that's absurd, but the rest of this math is absurd too. If you could not sleep and read one book per hour, it would take you 14,815 years without sleeping to read one book an hour to say that you've read every book ever written. That's not to mention that that's 14,815 years to read what has been published in the last 684 years. So while you're doing that, there's probably going to be 1 billion more books that are published, assuming all things stay status quo, society lasts that long, and so forth. There's a lot of things that can happen in 14,815 years. So what am I saying? I'm saying it is physically impossible for you to read everything. It's physically impossible for you to even read 1/10 of all the books that have ever been published. I won't even try to do this math with albums, even though the history is shorter. The number of albums out there, I'm sure that you could not listen to even a tenth of all the albums that have ever been produced. So musically speaking, and as far as books go, and you can do the same thing with movies. Once you decide you can't consume everything, well, then it becomes a very easy position to make. Why don't we have some discretion on what we do consume? That's not to say we can't sample a lot of things, but we need to savor more things. We need to savor more music that can influence us as musicians, that we can enjoy as listeners. We need to reread more books that can teach us something about something we're trying to learn. Or if it's a work of fiction and it's really profound and there's some stuff to get there, it's important to take time to reread that. I especially like fiction where it's not just a good story, but within the narrative, the author is providing profound insights. So as far as musicianship goes, I've talked about listening to music. That is one of the tools of the Musician Toolkit. But let's talk about music you would like to learn. Just as a pianist, if I lived to be 10,000 years old, I would never be able to learn all of the music written for the piano. And because playing piano is not my primary focus as a musician, I'm primarily a composer, an arranger, and a teacher. Piano is a close second to all that. It's in a close second tier to all of that. But because I do not invest the time needed to learn a lot of new music, I have to be particularly selective with what I go about learning. And I think even if you are primarily a performer, you're going to find the same thing. You need to find the pieces that you need to learn for your audition. You need to choose pieces that are going to help you grow. But also, if you find something and you really like it, you should keep playing it. I fell in love with the Brahms Rhapsody in G minor when I learned it when I was 19. Don't know if I've said this before. I am 48, going on 49. So I've been playing it for nearly 30 years. I don't think a year's gone by I haven't played it at least twice, and sometimes more than that. It's a piece I really love playing. Never get tired of it. And at least once I've gone back to re-practice it, like get the music out, not just play it, but get it out, and let's work on improving some things. You ever worked really hard on a piece and then have it disappear? You should spend at least as much time nurturing your repertoire as you do trying to add to it. Now, that's not to say you should abandon it completely. So one of the things that I think could be misconstrued from this episode is that David is saying you should just stick with all the things you've done already. Just re-listen to albums, reread the books you've read, re-practice the pieces you'd already learned. That is not at all what I'm saying, but I'm saying that the balance is not necessarily 50-50 at a certain point. I think if you're learning your instrument, if you're a beginner, most of what you should be doing is new because there's so much you need to explore to reach a certain point. But once you get to a certain level, once you are no longer a beginner, no longer really intermediate, but you're advanced and you're trying to become a polished artist, or you're professional and you're trying to become a successful business person, you should still seek out new information. You should still be listening to new music, but most of what you should be doing is to review what you've already discovered and learn it better rather than constantly seeking new thing after new thing. It's like I haven't even mentioned this. It doesn't have anything to do with music, but I love to travel. And I think how often I've visited a city and really love it, and how much I would enjoy going back to find new things and even revisit the places I discovered before. I've had the privilege of doing that with places like New York, which took me so long to get there for the first time. And, thankfully I got to make 3 more trips within a 3-year period. And it was so fun, going back to places. In fact, even going back to a restaurant that I discovered on a previous trip. A lot of times it's easy to think, I just want to go to as many new places as I can. But it's on revisiting places and getting to know it. And that's why they say if you really want a deep experience of being somewhere else, you should actually live there for a while. So in a summary, you should be planning more review with all the things that you consume and with all of the music that you learn, and not avoid new, but have less new in your life. More review, less new. And that's going to wrap up today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode, I would please encourage you to share it, especially with someone who might get some benefit from it. Share it to your news feed, and feel free to send me feedback. If it's private feedback on what you thought about the episode, you can do that with a message by going to my website at David Lane Music, or send me a message on social media at Instagram at David Lane Music, or Facebook at David M. Lane Music. And if you would like to share a comment for me to consider featuring on a future episode of this podcast, you can do so by going to speakpipe.com/musician toolkit, where you can leave me a voicemail. Again, that's going to wrap up today's episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I will be back with you again next week.